Okay, I think what we'll do is I'll ask if there are any questions. You can raise your hand. And if you have a particular question for a particular person, Dr. Miranda, Frinke, Garfinkel, Ducci, and Wallach. So you can ask them specifically, and if there aren't any hands that are raised, I'll read a question, okay? So does anyone have any questions right now? Okay.
I have a general question, which I think any of you might answer, and that is whether you're in a research field or a more practical field, what percentage of concerns for data privacy really go to the individual as opposed to avoiding legal liability for the people collecting or handling that data?
Can you repeat the question?
So the person asked, when you're in a research field, how much goes to actual ethical and moral concerns for people's privacy versus legal compliance issues? And certainly in the government, the ethical and moral concerns are reflected in the law. So the law articulates our societal beliefs about appropriate data handling, and that's specific to the public sector.
Well, that's certainly an ideal world answer.
Can I give a?
For folks in government, there are errors made, and there are.
Yeah, maybe I can give a second answer to this.
Pardon me?
Maybe I can give another answer. So I think there are circumstances where they kind of coincide, even in corporate America. So if you think about, let's say you're a major corporation and you want to do business in China or in Saudi Arabia or in places with more authoritarian governments, right? If you can guarantee to your users that your data is private and that you, the company, can't invert it, like can't figure out their data, then when a government comes to you and says, give us data on this person, you can legitimately say, no, we cannot. So it helps you avoid, it almost helps you avoid legal issues. You don't have subpoena risk, things like this. So there are situations where there's both sort of this altruistic motivation because, the corporation says, well, we believe in privacy. Conveniently, it allows them to do business and keep users safe. So there is sometimes a pretty substantial dovetailing of these things.
Yeah, well, I can't speak to percentage. But I don't know that there is a way to figure out the percentage of the time because you don't capture it that way. I will say that there are certain things I voluntarily take onto myself because I consider that these are a particularly important thing. So for instance, FISA warrant data, that would be something that's collected relative to the U.S. population under warrant, so that's court adjudicated, et cetera. Because we're research, we still work with that data and we're trained. I sign off on each one of those personally. I don't delegate that to my deputy, I don't delegate it to the chief, I don't delegate it down. So when any researcher who's working with that kind of data, they have to come and sit in my office and explain to me why and go through all of the steps to make sure that that's okay. So that's in the spirit and the letter of the law. And I see more of that than you might expect. People that are thinking of ways to go above and beyond while still staying in the rules.
Next question.
How is differential privacy used in a healthcare setting to perhaps anonymize or protect the privacy of patient records, PHI specifically?
Marilyn.
It's not.
So when you're granted access to electronic health records or other types of health data, you're typically granted access to the real data. And then there's the issue of where does that data sit, and when you present data, what are the requirements that are all spelled out in a data use agreement? What are the requirements for how you will present it? So there's this differential public display or public presentation that's required, but you actually get to work on the real data. And I just want to add one thing to your question. So there's this phrase from the business literature, which is that culture eats strategy for lunch. And I think a big component of to what extent are people thinking about moral and ethical obligations, whether it's with medical data or other kinds of data, has to do with the culture that we're building. And all of these organizations have, the Census Bureau, the NSA have culture, but that culture is a product of the people who they hire. And, three of us on the panel are responsible for helping to produce those people who they hire. So I think there's a huge responsibility on the part of the academy to think very hard about what's the culture that we want to build. And we can't just rely on individual PIs or individual faculty members, the vast majority of which vast majority of whom I would trust. But one of the ways you get a stronger culture is if you bring people together in the absence of their PI and have discussions about these sorts of things, so that they have a capacity to recognize and query things that might not be being done state of the art, whether consciously or unconsciously, right? So I think there is a particular responsibility on the part of the academy, because we produce the people who you have such a hard time finding to hire, and because those people, they're a scarce commodity right now, and they can all get jobs for, they can wherever they want to. We have to make sure that when they leave the academy with all those technical skills, they also leave the academy with a sense of we have moral and ethical obligations. And I think, I will say, Dan, with love in my heart, that computer science departments and electrical and computer engineering departments and statistics departments and applied mathematics departments for a long time said, that stuff, that's the job of social scientists and humanists. And I think now we're growing to understand that we actually, when we train computer scientists, we have to train them in more than just the technical aspects of their job.
So I'll add one more thing. So here at Rice, we're about to launch a new data science minor. And one of the requirements, there are 6 courses, and one of the courses that's required is on data ethics.
So I guess maybe I should respond to that. It's certainly the case that computer scientists, with great power comes great responsibility, and the computer science educational community has recognized that we need to train students to not just be robots who go and violate people's privacy to sell them better widgets. It's a heavy lift. We have a brand new ethics in computer science course here at Rice, taught by Moshe Vardi and an actual PhD in philosophy and ethics. And it's a new experiment. It immediately filled, and I hope that we'll do more of this. Our professional societies, the Association for Computing, what's the M? Machinery? We're not machinists, we're machinery. And, we have the ACM has a code of conduct as well in this area, and it's an evolving thing. And, and some people have even read it.
Let's go to another question.
So I'm just wondering, for something like redistricting, why isn't the original data used and in a confidential manner rather than the synthetic data, as you might say?
So we don't use the original data because then the redistricting would have to be confidential, and we'd have to have all of. So in the Census Bureau, in order to access the confidential data, you have to go through a background investigation. You have to be received annual training. Every use of the data has to be approved by the data custodians responsible for that data set. If the data involves the IRS tax data, it also has to be approved explicitly by the IRS. If it involves the healthcare data, it has to be approved by another organization. It would not be practical to use confidential data for doing redistricting. How would you conduct a hearing as to whether a redistricting plan is appropriate or not? The courts don't want to have access to confidential data. There are some courts that do, but most courts in this country we have public courts. it just wouldn't be possible.
Also,
So-
redistricting is a multi-layer problem. At the federal level, there's how many congressional seats does each state get? Right, and the census data helps answer that question. Then each state gets to draw the maps, and some of them have a variety of different things they're trying to optimize when they draw those maps. And they use all sorts of data.
They do, but by law, the Census Bureau meets with the secretaries of state of all the states, and they give us their requirements for data that they will use for drawing state legislative boundaries.
I'm going to go ahead and take one of the questions from the cards. This is for Dr. Franke. Do you stand behind the idea of a cyber defense Peace Corps as suggested by several organizations? What is the atmosphere at the NSA about this?
So I'm very careful not to answer policy questions in public, but let me see if I can get to the intent behind it. Cybersecurity Peace Corps, the concept as I've heard it mostly described is, can you have a bunch of people that will help the common citizen, the average person, identify cyber problems from a non-Department of Defense perspective? Is that close enough? So that's actually a very good idea, and a lot of states are doing that. We had talked about it back when I was at University of Idaho, and actually we made a parallel to that of Master Gardener. But what you want is, you do want to have locals that you can go to that you trust, that can help work with you on your computing problems. I will say that it's unlikely, unless there's some governmental structure behind that, though, that it's going to help you with the nation-state level. So what you're probably dealing with a Peace Corps is more local neighborhood level problems, more like a neighborhood watch. The next level up starts to get you into law enforcement, which is tricky. Even the local level can be tricky. And then nation-state, I don't think, fits that model of things that people, average citizens, can be trained to do. So recasting the question.
Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and push back on Simpson from earlier. I'm not so sure. I think the law helps in really specific concrete cases where we actually know what the objective is. But I kind of think that we have no idea what privacy even means. In particular, as Deb was pointing out, information fuses in really unanticipated ways. And the definition of what is damaging today is not the definition of what is damaging tomorrow. So to me, it seems like you all have worked on a bunch of really cool mechanisms that allow us to, once we have a very well-framed mathematical model, or we can push the thing into that, we can do something with it. So how do we start to gain a good definition of privacy? Is this something that computer scientists should be collaborating with philosophy departments on, with legal departments? How do we go about doing that?
Maybe I can give a couple brief answers. So one thing is, so differential privacy, which a few of us have talked about, the purpose of that definition is to basically make it so that there's very little information you can gain about somebody, whether or not he or she has participated in a data set or a study or something like that. And so you can actually give formal mathematical proofs about, that even if you have side information about them, it doesn't change anything. So it's resilient. It's provably resilient to side information. Or like if downstream, somebody found out something about you that wasn't supposed to be public, just because you had participated in a data set a long time ago, that wouldn't really actually change anything. And so it sort of really does. I don't know how to describe this more eloquently, unfortunately, but one of the successes of the definition is that it does do that. The consequence of this is it's a very powerful definition, and it makes it much harder to do things accurately, as we saw in some of
But it also assumes
that
you trust your data broker.
Yes, so it does assume trust. It assumes trust in your data broker. That is 100% true. And so now the question you have to ask yourself is, do you trust the census? That's question one. Question two is, do you trust, do you trust Google or Apple? If Google and Apple make their code open source and Dan goes over it, do you trust him to accurately go over the code?
I work with Dan, so.
So you don't answer that? I'll give you the coin. I'll give you the coin, and we'll ask you whether you trust him. Yeah. There's. I think this is a good question to have. Just like, where do you put the trust level? There's probably multiple barriers of trust. You kind of saw multiple barriers here. You're going to see multiple barriers of trust on your phones. Maybe you trust certain things to go off your phone. Maybe you trust Apple or Google or whoever's collecting that data in another way. This is all stuff to be kind of worked out that we are working out. We're working on it.
So if I hear you right, what you're really putting your finger on is that there needs to be policy that helps to define entities that have high trust requirement. Take any of those companies that you mentioned, which are zero regulated. Policy is ultimately established by Congress at a level of the kind we're talking about here. And the literacy level is virtually -10. You know, I mean, if you put, I can't think of a congressman that you could put in this room who would still be here to hear what the panel has to say.
I can, but I won't name names.
But I'm bringing it up in kind of a humorous way, but for all of the day's discussions, this last question got to the essence of the real problem. We do have a trust requirement. The census, I mean, you represented yourself quite well today. It's still a presidential appointee sitting at the top of your system. And so we've got room for some politics, I suspect. But how do we attack the question of, I don't know what to use the regulation word, there needs to be a policy that you impose on those that must be trusted so that they really can be trusted. And I can't imagine how the heck we're going to move toward that.
So I need to correct one thing that you said, which is that the federal statistical system is by design isolated from political decisions. And we know that if we allow politics to influence our statistics, that we won't have good statistics. So that is a ground rule that we have. And the Census Bureau has 2 political appointees. It's the director and the deputy director. And the director does not head the policy board. That's headed by the deputy director, who currently is a career civil servant. And there are somewhere between 12 and 24 other people on that board, and that board generally makes decisions by consensus. So, so we do not allow politics to influence official statistics in this country.
That's one of the reasons why we trust the census more than some other entities. But I interpreted your question to be not about policies to regulate the census, because we usually don't think about government policies to regulate a government agency. We think about government policies to regulate other entities. And so the whole question of, how do you, what kinds of regulations, how do we define data privacy, what types of data privacy regulations do you put into place for, for-profit companies operating in any number of spheres? And you can say that it's really complicated, but we have policies on lots of things that are really complicated. I think that, so I work on environmental health. I think air quality regulation is actually really, really complicated to understand. And we have, at some point or another, it's not actually the Congress people who understand any of those details, it's their staffers, right? So this is another role that I think that the Academy has to play, which is, number one, educating enough people who might not be able to write code and create the kinds of products, but who are well enough educated on the, information economy that we live in, that they can be intelligent consumers of the different kinds of products and approaches that are being used. So they don't write the code, but they understand what the code might be doing. And we need to be doing a job in the Academy of educating our students more broadly about what this whole information economy is about, what the issues are, offering these kinds of courses that Dan and Rudy were just talking about, and that they both know I'm a huge fan of. So the fact that it's complicated hasn't stopped us in the past, and the fact that we don't think that Congress people will understand all the details is less important than whether or not we can successfully get their staffers to understand the details. And their staffers typically have more kind of like topical area domain expertise, that we should I believe that educational institutions should be thinking of, one of their goals is to ensure that these kinds of people are educated well on the kinds of issues that our country and our world are facing in this new information economy that we live in.
So I just want to chime in a little bit beyond that. Regulation of our information economy is global because these companies are global. So even if the US isn't regulating them as much as perhaps they should, Europe with the GDPR, other countries are actively pursuing this. Even the US government, the Federal Trade Commission, has brought a lot of actions individually, and companies will argue back and say, you don't have authority to regulate us in this area, and it's a back and forth. But there's a lot going on. And you might say that many people will say that the GDPR is a bit of a mess. And certainly Europe's earlier cookie regulations were really stupid. Every website says, we give you cookies, yeah, whatever, okay. But they're getting better. And regulation is an iterative game. And over time, Europe will issue regulations, US will issue regulations, other countries will issue regulations, and these companies are going to have less flexibility than they have today. And that's a good thing.
But how do we know that the regulations are giving us anything useful?
How do we know the regulations are giving us anything useful? Well, when a company doesn't follow the regulations and goes out of business, that will be a strong signal to the rest of them.
Let me just also say, if I could, that with with GDPR and with CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, you are getting a better definition of consent, which was brought up earlier today. I just wanted to say that. You do get that out of that. And I think that's going to increase, if anyone would like to comment on that. Thank you.
Another question?
Are other countries doing things that we can learn and leverage so that we don't have to start everything from scratch, not that we are, but so that we can learn how they're solving data privacy issues across all of your different disciplines? Or do we just think that we do it the best in the world? And I won't make any other comments.
Okay, I'll just say a few things. So this is not an answer to your question, really, but some of the sort of best definitions in the academic world, differential privacy, this other strong privacy protections, are actually somewhat in opposition to definitions like the GDPR. Okay, so let me give a funny example. So the GDPR, this is the General Data Privacy Regulation, for those of you who have not heard this acronym. This is what Europe passed recently.
We call it good data practices at Rice.
I'm sorry. Anyway, so included in this is what's known as a right to be forgotten, which means you're supposed to be able to tell a company, hey, forget me. But now let's do a thought experiment. Suppose my company collects just the average responses of everyone in their database, and now you ask to be forgotten. Then they just go and delete you from the average. Now, if I saw the average before you asked to be forgotten and after, well, whoop, I know everything about you, right? And so this is in direct conflict with sort of what we might like from privacy, which is that you can't do that. And so things like in the academic world and that the census is adopting will prevent that, but they also kind of prevent some of the downstream things that you're supposed to be able to do under the GDPR from happening. So these things are still in tension. I don't think we have any. It's very challenging. We don't know what the right answers are, and I don't know anyone who does exactly.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would point to any one particular place where I'd say, boy, they're really doing it right. I think the reality is that we're in a world that's in rapid flux right now, both in terms of what the technologies can do and in terms of, our understanding that, maybe the policy apparatus needs to catch up with where the technologies are. And one of the problems with the policy apparatus catching up is the lead time on the policy apparatus is so long, and by the time you implement something, the technology has jumped even further ahead. So I'm done, no.
And on that note,
So just that whole notion that it is a really, really dynamic environment right now, and it's hard right now.
Yeah, so we're going to stop here. We have some closing remarks. Bill?
I'll be brief. I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for this rich discussion. Our panelists, great job. Thanks to all of you for hanging in there. We had a great turnout today. I do want to point out that there are representatives from the International Association of Privacy Professionals here today in the audience, and they will be at the reception if you want to talk to them some more. And again, I want to say thank you to the BRC staff. Thank you to our staff, especially Sarah Waugh. And there's a reception literally right out the door over there, right now. So thanks again.